Friends, I want to begin my remarks tonight on this Israel Shabbat in a way that may seem at first incongruous, but I hope in time will feel right. I want to start with a Torah story from all the way back in Genesis. It's a story of Jacob, Israel, overcome with emotion, a kind of joy that is unique in that it's unexpected joy. He finds himself weeping at the sight of grandchildren he never expected to see. Because we know from earlier in Genesis that Joseph, their father, was ripped from him. Joseph, who had tormented his brothers and taunted them with his dream interpretations and his tattletaling and his superiority and his coat. The brothers sought to kill him, and the last minute they sold him off to slavery, but that's not what their father knew. They took that coat of many colors, they doused it in blood, they brought it back to their father and said, "Joseph is gone. A wild beast must have devoured him." And so Jacob had rent his garments, he had mourned. He had thought he would never see Joseph again. And indeed, he did not for year upon year, even 2 decades. Until lo and behold, Joseph was alive, well, flourishing, had gone from slavery to running the greatest empire the earth had ever known. And he saved his family and brought his brothers, those same brothers, and his father down to Egypt where they could survive the famine and they could eat. And when Jacob was dying, he brought Joseph, and Joseph brought the grandsons so they could get a blessing from their grandfather. And just seeing Joseph, but more, seeing the grandsons. He said, "I never expected to see you again." And here, God has let me see your children as well. Tonight, I want to share a second story. A story from our Israel trip. 3 weeks ago, I shared 4 stories from our Israel trip. 43 temple members had the experience of a lifetime, the most wonderful time, 10 days in Israel together. I shared 4 stories, but I said I'm saving one. For 3 weeks, you have to come back for Israel Shabbat. Well, here you are. You wait no longer. This story occurs on day 2 of our trip, our Tel Aviv day. This was the day that we started out at the newly rebuilt Emanu Museum that many of us had seen online during the pandemic. We got a tour and so forth. We got to see it in person at Tel Aviv University. Then we went to a gourmet market, had some good eats, and then we went walking through old Tel Aviv. I mean, Tel Aviv's not that old, but the oldest streets of Tel Aviv, its founding streets, the Dizengoffs and the Rothschilds and so forth. Now, that day happened to be a special day. and all the planning that we did in this trip, we couldn't have predicted and planned for how special that day would become. Because it just so happened that that Friday, which is the beginning of Israel's weekend, it's Friday and Saturday in Israel, that Friday was the first weekend day following Purim. Now, Purim in Israel is a raucous affair. It's a bacchanal like, they do in New Orleans for, that whole... Similar in Israel, Purim is kind of like a week-long celebration. The night of Purim is a huge party in the streets. But in Tel Aviv, they do it again on the weekend following Purim. It was mayhem. It was, here we are trying to walk around, like the old streets and get a feel, for Tel Aviv. And we were going, to artisan fair and so forth. But we were completely swarmed by 20-somethings. 20-somethings, everybody wall to wall was between the age of 21, 22, and 29, it seemed. And they were all in costume. Everybody was in costume everywhere. All kinds of costumes. Oddly, I must have seen 100 people dressed up as McDonald's employees. I don't know why. I don't know if that was like some ironic thing or that was like that trend that year, because I'd never seen it before, but we saw 100 McDonald's employees running around, but they weren't real McDonald's. I mean, they were like spruced up, but they were just going crazy. And we were all just eating it up. I mean, what we wanted, we wanted ancient Israel, and we got it. We wanted the natural beauty of the desert and the flowers in bloom, because we were there in the rainy season, the wildflower season, and we got it. But we also wanted to get a sense of the vitality of the modern state of Israel that is alive and bustling and visceral. And boy, did we get it on that day. We were tossed about and we were trying to take pictures of everybody. They would look so adorable. They were having so much fun. It wouldn't have gone over very well in Florida because there was a lot of gender cross-dressing in every direction. But it was a crazy scene, and there was music playing in every square. There were live bands and there were DJs. It was just, the whole city was alive in a party of a Purim, which is thousands of years old holiday from salvation in Persia, and it's still being celebrated with great vitality. And then we left the crowds and we continued on our way to Rothschild Street, the first street of Tel Aviv, because we had a destination in mind. And that was to get to Independence Hall. Independence Hall is the spot. They didn't call it that then. They called it the Tel Aviv Museum, or they called it that building. Later, it got the name because 75 years ago, minus, 3 days, 75 years ago, is out of that hall that Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence and proclaimed the foundation of the State of Israel. You can't go into Independence Hall right now. It's gone through multi-year renovation. So instead, we stood in the center of Rothschild Street, which has a walkway in the middle of this, like a promenade, I guess it is. Because that's where the people heard it. The Declaration of Independence was supposed to be a secret meeting. It was actually several hours before the culmination of the British Mandate, but because it was a Friday, they wanted to get it in before Shabbat. And because it was a vulnerable situation with all of the leaders of the Zionist state all in one building, it was a secret. But it turned out to be a poorly kept secret. Because by the time Ben-Gurion went to read it in that building, the street outside was flooded with people all the way across. Flooded with people so that they got loudspeakers to broadcast the events inside so that everyone outside could hear the ceremony and the reading and the establishment of the state. When we stood there, and the people on the trip can tell you, they will always remember that moment. We recalled the sensation of what it must have felt like for the people who were there at the time of that first reading. How they must have felt, and all of the mix of emotion. First, the exhilaration. They weren't born there. They came with a dream. I guess the little ones were born there. But they packed up and left for this seemingly godforsaken land with malaria, with poverty and famine. It was a tough life to build that state. But they worked and they worked and they struggled, and together they established a state. And there they were on Rothschild Street that day to bear witness to the establishment of a state in Israel, independently ruled by Jews for the first time in almost 2,000 years since the Roman conquest. There they were to witness history and their own personal achievement. But mixed with that euphoria was the trepidation and the dread. Because they knew that that day marked not just the beginning of the state of Israel, but the end of the British mandate. The end of the British forces would be evacuating that day. The war would begin tomorrow. And in truth, the war had begun already 6 months earlier. It started the day after the UN decree that established two states, a Jewish and an Arab state, dividing up the land. The next day, the Palestinians attacked and the Jordanians attacked. Those 6 months are known in Israel as the Civil War. While the British were still there, the fighting began. Each of our cities, each of our settlements, each kibbutz was attacked and attacked. And there was hardly anything that we could do. But we knew it was only going to get worse. Because the next day, 6 armies would attack, joining the Palestinians: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. And the people who stood on that promenade knew what was coming. And they knew their chances were not so good. There was an embargo preventing the Jews from bringing in weapons, of any kind. The British wouldn't allow it. The United States wouldn't allow it. The UN wouldn't allow it. Israel, rather, what would be Israel, had not a single cannon and not a single tank. And every gun and every bullet was smuggled. Meanwhile, the Arab armies were fully armed. In fact, Egypt and Jordan were stocked by Britain as part of a military alliance. Just days before the Declaration of Independence, the chief of operations, Yigael Yadin, told David Ben-Gurion, quote, "The best we can tell you is we have a 50-50 chance." Indeed, the very day, the euphoria that the Declaration of Independence was read, that very day, just miles away, in the Etzion block of kibbutzim, 4 kibbutz were overrun by the Jordanian forces and the Palestinian forces. 3 of the kibbutzim, those who were present were taken as prisoners of war and sent to Jordan. And in one, they massacred and killed everyone in the kibbutz. 127 men and women were killed that day while they were in captivity. The children had already been sent away. The day they stood to receive the Declaration of Independence, that night they would go back into their homes in Tel Aviv and suffer the first bombardment of Egyptian Air Force bombing Tel Aviv that night. So those who stood in the promenade felt the euphoria of the day, but also the dread and the fear, because they looked around and wondered, who would survive this? Which of their friends and family members would they lose in this pending war? And if they should fail, what would happen? Just months before, Azam Pasha, the Secretary General of the Arab League, had declared the intentions of these 6 Arab nations. He said, quote, "It will be a war of annihilation. It will be a momentous massacre in history that will be talked about like the days of massacres of the Mongols or the Crusades." They had to wonder, while they were celebrating, would any of them survive? And if some got away, where would they go? Well, we know what happened. Israel survived that war. Israel successfully repelled Palestinian neighbors and 6 invading armies. In fact, Israel even gained territory that was allotted to them by the United Nations. But Israel also lost the old city of Jerusalem and so many lives. During that war of independence, 6,373 Jewish Israelis died. That was 1% of the population. It would be like if today 3 million Americans died in a war. Everyone lost someone. But what we were there, who were there that day, we knew something that the people who were there 75 years ago didn't know. We had just fought our way bustling through a Purim celebration of thousands of 20-somethings dressed in costume. The people who were there 75 years ago dreamed of a state of Israel. They hoped to just have a state, a place where people could go, a refuge, where never again borders would be closed to Jews. They just wanted a place of their own, just enough to make it. They could never have imagined. How could they? The skyline of Tel Aviv today, the industry, the high-tech innovation, the medicine, the startup nation. How could they possibly have hoped to imagine that? How could they have hoped to imagine all of those young people celebrating? It was like Jacob before he died. I never expected to see you again. And here, God has let me see your children as well.